All right, for this video, we're going to be talking about EU enlargement. Uh, what countries have joined over time, what the process is, and also the pros and cons thereof. If a country wants to join the EU, right, just the general logistic process is that first you have to apply. And the European Commission, if you remember from the previous video, the European Commission was the EU institution that drafts laws, right? So basically, the European Council, as the driver, right, will take this application to the European Commission. The European Commission has to say yes or no to the application, and then the lawmaking parties, right? So all the different EU governments then have to agree based on a framework of negotiations. So, in general, an EU government might have to make, or rather, an EU applicant might have to make certain changes to its government. It definitely needs to meet all the legal expectations of the EU, right? It has to, of course, adopt all EU legislation. So, basically, all the different political institutions have to agree before they actually formally start negotiations to let the country in. After these negotiations, a country has to sign a treaty of accession. Accession just means that they're joining. And again, this has to be ratified by all member nations before it officially joins the EU. And the different considerations to get into the EU are called the Copenhagen Criteria. So basically, any applicant country, first off, has to have a free market economy. The EU, based on, of course, the single market, free trade, you can surmise that it is very much a capitalist type of economic organization. They also, of course, have to have a stable democracy. So we can consider how certain countries that might have had some political instability, like Turkey, might be on the fence for EU membership, partially due to that. And also, of course, they have to accept all EU laws and, of course, agree to abide by them before they can join the EU. All right? And so that's one of the reasons why certain countries have been on the fence for a long period of time. Their applications are pending because one of these conditions has not yet been met. All right, I wanted to add this quote because, of course, just bringing everything from the EU back to the notion of community, we could think about how, as the EU enlarges, whether or not these conditions are still true, right? So, communities are not built of friends, or of groups with similar styles and tastes, or even of people who like and understand each other. They are built of peoples who feel they are part of something that is bigger than themselves, a shared goal or enterprise, like righting a wrong, or building a road, or raising children, or living honorably, or worshiping a god. To build community requires only the ability to see value in others, to look at them and see a potential partner in one's enterprise. So, what I think is interesting about this is, in ways, it shows that the EU can be part of a community even as it enlarges. Like this first part, communities are not built of friends or of people who are similar, right? Or who people like and understand each other. This seems to be sort of an idea about how the EU, sort of embraces the idea of diversity in some ways, like that it is part of something bigger than themselves. They don't need to have a shared goal, right? So, like, this part of the quote seems to suggest that the EU can be part of a community, but then the next part is really interesting to see value in others, to look at them and see a potential partner in one's enterprise. That might show us ways in which the EU's sense of community is limited, right? If they don't agree, as we talked previously in this slide, to a certain country's overall approach towards governance, towards the economy, then they cannot be members of that community. So that certainly shows us a limitation. All right, I don't want to go over anything on this slide, but I just wanted to encourage you guys to go back to these two documents. They're here on slide 42 on the review slides. Click on both of these hyperlinks. They are live links, and they give you really good perspectives, pro and against EU enlargement. And I just want to summarize that quickly, but those articles in the previous slide actually really get into the details, right? And so the pros and cons of EU expansion. First off, there would be more political stability in continental Europe. Remember that back even when the European Coal and Steel Community formed, and then subsequently the European Economic Community, the whole point was to prevent future conflict, right? So by further integrating economically, and then as the EU develops, also politically, you have power in numbers, right? The more you're intertwined, the less likely you're going to fight. And that can be also proven by the fact that we haven't seen a major European war break out, at least not one across multiple European countries, since the EU solidified in the 1990s. It also acts as a check to U.S. power, right? The larger the EU is, the more it acts like a global superpower. And so it can sort of keep the U.S. in check. We can consider even why the EU is necessary as an answer to NATO in that respect. It also just adds cultural and economic diversity to the EU. Although it's worth pointing out that as the EU enlarges, there might be certain people that consider that diversity to be a con. Speaking of cons, one thing that certain countries are worried about is that the larger the EU gets, the larger financial strain there will be on the stronger countries, right? As we were saying in a previous video, the biggest amount of the EU's budget is allocated towards aiding poorer nations. And so the worry of the larger economic nations is that they will increasingly bear the brunt of this burden in terms of aiding their less fortunate member states. Um, also, they're worried that there might be job losses in wealthier nations. The worry is, of course, as poorer nations join, that they would have a cheaper cost of labor, and so certain businesses might pick up and set up shop in these other countries. Sort of the same fear that the U.S. had with NAFTA. Um, but we could also ask the question, is this outweighed by job gains overall, right? In general, the European Union economy has grown, which we're going to look at in the next slide. So we could kind of ask, all right, well, as the EU member citizens have increased purchasing power, does that actually create more jobs overall? So to a certain extent, we can negate this reason. But uh, one really valid fear of EU enlargement is the loss of national sovereignty, right? As the EU would grow in size, the more eclipsed a nation's individual power is, right? Right now, you are one of 28 member states that has to agree on legislation, right? And with the exception of the European Parliament, all the other governing institutions are made up of equal numbers. So if you're a large state like Germany, you have the exact same voice as a small state like Malta. And so consider as new nations are added on to the EU, how your voice would just increasingly get sort of overshadowed, your national voice that is, by the voice of the EU overall. So that's a really big fear of a lot of nations about EU enlargement. This slide is talking about how the EU has grown over time and how the economy has grown on with it, right? So when the European Economic Community started, there were 6 members and they spoke 4 languages. It was comprised of 177 million people, and their annual output was $1.6 trillion. That was in 2014 dollars. And then think about how much it has grown over time. The EU now has 28 members. They speak 24 different languages, so certainly there has been more cultural diversity to the EU over time. Their population has expanded tremendously. Now, the EU member nations, together, there are 505 million people represented in the EU, and also their GDP is now $19 trillion. So consider how much bigger it's grown over time, which is one of the reasons why membership is most likely more appealing over time, right? Consider how this GDP growth would be an incentive for other nations to join. Next, we will talk about Euroscepticism, so we're going to start that with a new video. So stay tuned for that, and thanks.